I had not planned on coming back to Caldwell Flats. That town was 15 years behind me, and I'd ridden hard to keep it that way, through Wyoming, into Montana, down into the Texas Panhandle with a crew of 18 men and 10,000 cattle, and enough trail dust to fill a man's lungs for the better part of a decade. I had put ground between myself, and that place the way a man puts ground between himself and a wound he doesn't quite know how to dress, fast, and without looking back. But my brother Ellis died in October, and Ellis had left behind a parcel of land, a leaking barn, and a set of debts that only a blood relation could untangle. So I rode south through the cold, and somewhere past the ridge where the cottonwoods grow thick along the creek, I smelled wood smoke and felt the town pulling me in like a current. It was a Tuesday morning when I came over the last rise and saw Caldwell Flats laid out below me, the same main street, the same weathered storefronts, the livery and the feed store and the little white church at the far end with its crooked steeple. 15 years had put a new coat of paint on some of the buildings and taken it clean off others. A water trough had moved. The telegraph office had expanded. But it was the same town, the same gray November sky pressing down on it, and I sat my horse on that rise for a full minute before I gave him the heel and rode down. I am not a man who spends much time examining his own thinking. The trail teaches you to deal with what's in front of you, the mud, the weather, the cattle that want to scatter, the men who need feeding and paying. You don't get much use out of regret on the open range. It just adds weight to a load that's already heavy, and weight slows a man down. But I will tell you this. When I rode into Caldwell Flats on that Tuesday morning, the first thing I looked for before the attorney's office, before Ellis's place out on the North Road, was the schoolhouse. It sat where it always had, at the east end of town, a square wooden building with 2 windows on each side, and a bell she never rang before 7 in the morning, because she said children needed their sleep. There was a thin column of smoke rising from the chimney. The yard out front was empty, school in session, I supposed, and the gate was shut, same as always, with a latch that stuck in the cold. I did not stop. I rode past at a walk, looking straight ahead the way a man does when he is trying very hard not to look at something, and I went and found the attorney and spent 2 hours in a cold office talking about Ellis's debts and Ellis's land. Her name was Clara Mays. She had come to Caldwell Flats the year before I met her, hired on to run the schoolhouse after the previous teacher left to marry a man in Abilene. I was 26 that year and running cattle for a rancher named Duval, a good man, Duval, steady and fair, and I'd seen Clara at the church social in September, standing at the edge of the gathering with a cup of cider and a look on her face like she was cataloging everything she saw and filing it away for later. She had dark hair she wore pinned up, and eyes the color of the creek in late afternoon, and a stillness about her that I mistook at first for shyness. It wasn't shyness. It was judgment, patient and careful, and once she decided you were worth her time, she gave it to you without reservation. We talked for 2 hours at that social. I walked her home. We talked for another hour on her porch. I rode home in the dark feeling like a man who just found a $20 gold piece in his coat pocket, surprised and certain at once that the luck was real. That was how it started. For 2 years it went on. Sunday afternoons on her porch, and sometimes she would let me carry wood in or fix the schoolhouse gate when the latch froze, and on winter evenings I'd sit by her stove while she graded her student sums and we would talk about everything, about nothing, about what we both wanted and where we both thought we were headed. I'm not a man who talks easily, but with Clara I talked. She had a way of listening that made a man feel his words were worth something. I believed we were headed the same direction. What I did not see, what pride kept me from seeing, was that Clara was also friendly toward a man named Rupert Gale. Gale was a merchant, respectable, steady, the kind of man a schoolteacher's family would approve of. He called on her in the afternoon sometimes when I was out on Duval's range. He brought her things, books mostly, and once a bolt of good cloth. I heard about it from a hand named Cutter who meant well and said less than he thought he said. And what I built in my own mind out of Cutter's half-finished sentences was a picture of a woman who was keeping two men warm and was about to choose the safer one. I was wrong. I did not know I was wrong. I was 28 years old and I had a working man's pride, and I will not dress it up any prettier than that. I went to her on a Friday evening and I said my piece, not gently, not with the kind of care the situation called for, and I told her I was not the kind of man who shared, and if she'd made her choice she ought to say so plainly. She looked at me across her kitchen table with those Creekwater eyes and she said, very quietly, that she hadn't made any choice at all, because she hadn't been asked a question. I left before she finished the sentence. I told myself, riding away from Caldwell Flats in the cold before dawn the next morning, that a woman who couldn't simply say she wanted me wasn't a woman worth staying for. I told myself that for 15 years. I told it on the cattle drives and in the bunkhouses and in the long silences of the high plains, and eventually I stopped saying it out loud and just carried it the way you carry a stone in your boot. Always there, never comfortable, never quite enough to stop you walking. The attorney's name was Farrow. He had Ellis's papers sorted into 3 piles on his desk, and he walked me through the debts first, then the land, then a small account Ellis had kept at the Caldwell Bank. The debts were manageable. The land was worth less than I'd hoped and more than I'd feared. Farrow was patient and precise, and when we were done, he shook my hand and said Ellis had been well thought of in town, which I already knew. Ellis was a better man at staying than I ever was. I spent the rest of that first day out at Ellis's place, walking the fence line and taking stock of what needed doing. The barn needed new boards on the south face. One of the pasture fences had gone down in the fall, and the posts were still lying in the grass. The house itself was tight enough, Ellis had kept it, and there was firewood stacked against the west wall that would last through December. I worked until the light was gone, then came back to town and took a room at the boarding house on the main street. The woman who ran the boarding house was named Mrs. Aldridge. She was about 60, brisk and forthright, and she set a plate of stew in front of me without being asked and said, "You're Ellis Holt's brother." I recognized the chin. "Amos Holt," I said. "I know who you are," she said. "Caldwell Flats isn't so big a town that people forget." She poured coffee and sat across from me in the way that landladies sometimes do when they've decided you're worth the company. "You'll be here how long?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. She nodded. "Plenty of work out at Ellis's place, I expect." "Enough," I said. She let the quiet sit for a moment, the way comfortable people do. Then she said, "Clara Mays is still at the schoolhouse, if you were wondering." I had not said I was wondering. I picked up my coffee and said I wasn't. Mrs. Aldridge said, and the way she said it made clear she'd been running a boarding house long enough to know the difference between what men said and what they meant. I finished my stew and went to bed. The next morning I was at Ellis's place by first light. I had a list. The barn boards, the fence posts, the chimney cap that Farrow had mentioned was loose. Physical work is a mercy when your mind needs occupation, and I gave myself to it fully, splitting wood and driving nails, until the cold air was moving through my coat like it had somewhere to be. By noon I'd replaced 4 fence posts and patched 2 sections of the south barn wall, and I ate the bread and salt pork I'd packed standing up in the barn doorway, looking out at Ellis's pasture going gray-gold in the November light. He'd had a good piece of land, Ellis. Not a big spread, but well kept, the kind of property a patient man builds over years of careful work. I had always been the one who moved. Ellis had been the one who stayed. And looking out at what staying had built him, even in debt, even with the barn needing work, I felt something I did not want to examine too closely. I was tightening the last fence post when I heard boots on the frozen ground behind me, and turned to find a boy of about 10 standing at the fence line, watching me with the flat, assessing look children get when they're trying to decide if an adult is interesting or not. "You're the drover," he said. I'm Ellis Holt's brother, I said. Amos. Miss May said you'd be working out here, the boy said. She sent a pie. He was holding a cloth-wrapped bundle with both hands, the way children hold things they've been told not to drop. I came and took it from him and found a wedge of dried apple pie wrapped in a clean cloth, still faintly warm. She sent it for Mr. Ellis's funeral, but you came too late, the boy said, with the bluntness children use when they don't yet know what to soften. She said you should have it anyway. She said he screwed up his face trying to remember. She said working men need feeding. I stood with that pie in my hands for a moment. What's your name? I said. Owen Ferris. My pa has the feed store. Tell Miss Mays I said thank you, Owen. He nodded like a man concluding business, then turned and walked back across the frozen pasture toward the road. I watched him go. Then I looked down at the pie in my hands, the cloth folded neat and careful the way she always folded things, and I set it on the fence post and did not move for a good minute. She still fed working men. 15 years gone, and the woman still thought to send a pie to a man who'd left her without a proper word. I ate it standing up in the cold. It was the best dried apple pie I'd had in 15 years, and that is not a small statement from a man who'd eaten in cookhouses from the Platte to the Rio Grande. I did not seek her out. I want to say that plainly because I think it matters. I did not go looking for Clara Mays. What I did was work Ellis's place every day, breakfast early at Mrs. Aldridge's, and in the evenings walk the short length of Caldwell Flats's Main Street because there was nowhere else to walk. If that route happened to take me past the schoolhouse, it was because the schoolhouse was on the way from one end of town to the other, and a man can only walk in so many directions on one street. On the fourth evening I was coming back from the north end of town when the schoolhouse gate swung open and Clara stepped through it. She hadn't seen me yet. She was pulling the gate shut behind her, one hand on the latch, and she had a satchel over one arm and a coat buttoned against the cold, and she looked different, and exactly the same in the way that 15 years does to a person you once knew better than you knew yourself. There were lines at the corners of her eyes now and a silver thread or two in the dark hair, still pinned up the way she'd always worn it, and her back was straight, and her step was the same measured, purposeful step she'd always had, the step of a woman who knew where she was going and saw no reason to hurry. She looked up and saw me. We stood about 10 feet apart on the frozen ground and said nothing for a moment. Amos Holt, she said. Her voice was steady, of course it was. Clara, I said, which was not much, but it was all I had. I heard you were settling Ellis's affairs, she said. I'm sorry about Ellis. He was good to this town. He was, I said. He always was. She shifted the satchel on her arm. I was aware of the cold and the empty street and the absolute uselessness of everything I might say. Thank you for the pie, I said. Owen said you were working hard. Working men need feeding. A pause. It was Ellis's pie, really. I'd already made it. It was a good pie. They usually are, she said, and there was the faintest edge of something in it, not unkind, just honest, the way she'd always been honest about the things she was good at without apology. I expect you're heading home, I said. I am. I'll walk you, I said, which came out before I'd decided to say it, the way things do sometimes when a man has been thinking without knowing he's thinking. She studied me for a moment, those Creekwater eyes 15 years older and not 1 degree softer. Then she said, all right, and we walked. She lived in the same house, a small frame house 2 streets east of the schoolhouse, with a covered porch and a kitchen garden she'd put to bed for the winter, the beds neat and mulched and waiting. The walk was 10 minutes. We talked about Ellis mostly, what he'd built, what he'd been like in the years I'd been gone, the way he'd become a steadying presence in the town's small life. Clara had known him well. She said he used to stop by the schoolhouse sometimes and fix things without being asked, which sounded like Ellis all over. We talked about the land and the fence, and the barn repairs I was working through, and she asked good, practical questions the way she always had, and I answered them. And by the time we reached her gate, the 10 minutes felt like 2 and also like 100 years. She stopped at her gate, and I stopped beside her. "Thank you for the walk," she said. "Thank you for the company," I said. She put her hand on the latch. I watched her, and then, because apparently 15 years had not taught me any better, I said, "Clara, about the way I left." She was quiet for a moment. The cold was settling, the sky going dark and purple at the edges. "You don't have to," she said. "I think I do," I said. "I think I should have a long time ago." She looked at me steadily. "Then come in for coffee," she said, "and say it where it's warm." Her kitchen was the same kitchen, small, clean, the iron stove throwing good heat, a row of her students' drawings pinned to the wall above the window. The coffee pot was already on. She poured 2 cups without asking and set them on the table and sat down, and I sat across from her in the chair I'd sat in 100 times 15 years ago, and I took my hat off and set it on my knee. "I was wrong," I said. "What I believed about you and Rupert Gale, what I said before I left. All of it was wrong, and it wasn't fair to you, and I left before you could set me straight." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Rupert Gale brought me books," she said. "He was kind. He was interested. I was not interested in return. I told him so that same November after you left, and he accepted it graciously and eventually married a woman from Lahoma who was better suited to him." She looked at her cup. "He sends a Christmas card every year." I sat with that. "You left before I could explain anything," she said. "And I will tell you honestly, I was angry about that for a long time, not because you doubted me. Doubt is human, but because you didn't ask. You made up a story and rode away in it." "Yes," I said. "I did. It would have taken you 5 minutes to ask me a plain question and get a plain answer." "I know. And instead it took 15 years. Her voice was even, not hot. The anger was old and had burned down to something cooler, but it was still there in the shape of the words. "I know," I said again. "I don't have an argument against any of it, Clara. I was 28 and I was proud and I was afraid, and the fear came out sideways as anger and I rode away. There's no good reason in it. I've had 15 years to look at it and there's no good reason." She was quiet for a while. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the kitchen window in its frame. "What do you want, Amos?" she said. Which was the question, wasn't it? The only question. "I don't know exactly how to say it," I said. "I've been working out on Ellis's place these last days and I keep thinking." I stopped. Started again. "Ellis stayed. He stayed here and he built something and people liked him, and when he was gone they were sorry about it in the real way, not just the polite way. And I've been riding since I was 28 years old. I've been on more ranches and drives than I can count, and I'm good at it. I'm not complaining about the life. But I came back here to this town to settle up Ellis's affairs, and the first thing I looked for when I rode in, I stopped again." She was watching me. "The first thing I looked for was the schoolhouse," I said. "I wasn't planning on it. I wasn't even aware I was doing it. But there it was." The kitchen was warm and quiet. Clara turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands. "I'm not asking anything from you," I said. "I don't have the right to ask anything. What I came in here to say is that I'm sorry for leaving the way I did, for the 15 years of silence, for not being the kind of man who could say a plain thing and ask a plain question instead of riding away in his own pride." She nodded slowly. "I accept the apology," she said. "I accepted it some years ago, honestly, when I stopped being angry. It's easier to carry without the anger." "I expect it is. But I want to know," she said, "what you meant by that you came in here because of the schoolhouse. What that means to you." I looked at my hat on my knee. I am not a man who finds the right words fast. I've always been better at work than at talking. But she had always been patient with my silences, and she was patient now, sitting across from me with her coffee and her steady eyes, and so I tried. "It means," I said, "that I think I've been going the wrong direction for 15 years. Not wrong in every way. I've done good work, I've been honest, I've taken care of the men who rode with me. But wrong in the direction, away from here." I paused. "Away from you." She was still watching me. "I'm going to be here 3 weeks at least," I said. "Maybe longer if the land takes time to settle, and I don't know what you'd want after all this. I don't know if there's anything left to want, but I thought." I stopped. "I thought I'd rather say it and be wrong than leave again without saying it." Clara set down her coffee cup. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at me. "You know what I told myself," she said, "after you left?" "I don't." "I told myself that if Amos Holt ever came back to Caldwell Flats, I would say what I had not said the first time, because I was proud too, that night in my kitchen. You weren't the only one. I could have said plainly that I had no interest in Rupert Gale, that my interest was in you, and that I was waiting for you to say the thing you'd been circling for 2 years. I didn't say it. I gave you an answer that required you to already know the question, and that was not fair either." She looked at me steadily. "We were both foolish." "We were," I said. "I have thought about that for 15 years, she said. "And I have run my schoolhouse and lived my life, and it has been a good life. I want you to understand that. I am not a woman who spent 15 years waiting and pining. I built something here." "I know you did," I said. "I can see it." "But I also," she said carefully, "never stopped thinking that if you came back I would say the thing I didn't say." The kitchen was warm. The wind was at the window. I held my hat and waited. "I wanted you to stay," she said. "That night and every day after it. I wanted you to ask me the plain question instead of making up a story and leaving in it. And the answer to the plain question would have been yes." She held my eyes. "It would still be yes. If you're asking it now." I set my hat on the table. I would not call it an easy thing, what happened in the weeks that followed. 2 people who have been apart for 15 years and who have each built a life in the absence of the other do not simply fold back together like they were never separated. There were awkward evenings and quiet lunches and more than one conversation where we each came up against the edges of who we'd become. She had her schoolhouse and her town and her rhythms, and I had the trail and 15 years of keeping no one's schedule but the cattle's, and we both had pride in the things we'd built and were careful not to pretend otherwise. But we also had Sunday afternoons on her porch again, bundled against the November cold, and coffee in her kitchen on 3 evenings that first week, and a long walk out to Ellis's place on the Saturday when I finished the fence repair, and she came to see it and told me Ellis would have been pleased, and I believed her. We had the easy silences that come back faster than you think when you've once known them with a person, and we had her laughter. She had always had a low, unhurried laugh that she didn't give to everyone, and we had the slow, careful business of learning who we were now alongside who we'd been. I sent word to my current employer, a good outfit in Wyoming, that my return would be delayed. He was a fair man and he had 3 capable hands. He'd manage. At the end of the second week, I drove out to Ellis's property with a surveyor Farrow recommended, and we walked the whole parcel and talked over what it was worth and what could be done with it. The land was better than I'd thought. Good pasture, a solid well, the creek running clean along the eastern fence. I stood at the corner of the north pasture looking south and thought about what a man could build on 40 acres if he was a man who stayed. I asked Farrow that same afternoon what Ellis's debts would look like once the bank account was settled. Farrow laid it out. There was a remaining figure that I could cover from what I'd saved. Not comfortable, not easy, but possible, the kind of possible that feels like a closed door opening. "You thinking of keeping the property?" Farrow asked. "I'm thinking about it," I said. He nodded. "A man could do worse," he said. "Good land, quiet town, people here are decent." "I know they are," I said. On the Friday evening of the second week, I walked Clara home from the schoolhouse again, and at her gate I stood the way I'd stood 2 weeks before, Except this time I did not go in, and there was no difficult conversation to have. There was just the cold air and the sound of the town settling into evening, and Clara with her satchel and her coat and her steady eyes. "I'm thinking about keeping Ellis's place," I said. She looked at me. "It's good land," I said. 40 acres. Enough for a small spread, maybe some cattle, manageable without a full crew. I know how to work land. I know how to work. I paused. Caldwell Flats needs anything, a man who can work. She was quiet for a moment. The faintest trace of something, not quite a smile, not quite not at the corner of her mouth. "The school board has been talking about needing a fence along the east yard," she said. "For 3 years. Nothing's happened." "I can build a fence," I said. "I imagine you can." We looked at each other in the cold evening light. "Clara," I said, and I had promised myself I would not make the same mistake twice. I would not circle it. I would not make a story out of it and ride away in the story. "I'm asking you the plain question. If I stay, if I keep Ellis's land and build something on it and stay in Caldwell Flats, is the answer the same? What you said in your kitchen?" She looked at me for a long, steady moment. "Amos Holt," she said, "I have been teaching children for 20 years. The first thing I teach them is to use plain words." She put her hand on the gate latch. "Yes," she said. "The answer is yes. Come to supper tomorrow." I came to supper. I stayed. It was not what either of us had imagined it would be. The life we built imagining is for younger people, and we were not young anymore. What we built instead was real, and a real thing has weight and grain and the occasional splinter, and you learn its actual shape instead of the shape you had in your head. She kept her schoolhouse. I worked Ellis's land and bought 6 head to start and hired on a young hand named Dillard who was good with horses and eager to learn. By spring, the north pasture was fenced properly and the barn was sound, and I had taken to spending my evenings at Clara's kitchen table the way I'd done 20 years ago, and it felt like no time at all and like all the time in the world. We married in June, in the white church at the end of the main street with the crooked steeple. Mrs. Aldridge baked the cake. Owen Farris, the boy who'd brought me the pie, served as Dillard's junior assistant in the entirely unnecessary role of official holder of the horses, a position he took very seriously. Pharaoh shook my hand on the steps afterward and said Ellis would have been glad, and I said I thought so too, and I meant it. I will tell you what I know about staying, now that I've done it for some years and have some right to speak on the subject. It is not, as I'd always told myself on the trail, the smaller thing. A man on a cattle drive tells himself that staying is for men who ran out of ambition, men who couldn't cut it on the range, men who needed a fence around them. That's what I told myself for 15 years. I was wrong about that the same way I was wrong about Clara and Rupert Gale. I made up a story that kept me from looking at the thing plainly. Staying takes more than riding. Riding is one direction. Staying is every direction at once, every day. It is a fence built right, and then mended when the winter takes it. It is the first frost on the north pasture, and knowing where the cattle need to be before it comes. It is a woman at supper with her students' work spread across the table, and the low, unhurried laugh she gives when she catches me pretending to understand a third grader's arithmetic. It is the slow accumulation of mornings, which is the only real wealth a man can gather, and the only kind he can't spend on the trail. We had 31 years of mornings. I rode the Caldwell Flats Range for 31 years, and in all of it, I never once looked south toward the road that led out and thought I'd made the wrong choice. There were hard years, a drought in the 5th year that killed 2/3 of the herd and set us back 3 years in debt, a winter that took the barn roof, the year Clara was sick for 6 weeks in the fall, and I did not sleep more than a few hours at a time for 6 weeks straight. Hard years are part of a real life. They are not an argument against it. In the 31st year, on a Tuesday in November, same month I'd ridden back into town, same gray sky, same cottonwoods along the creek. I fixed the schoolhouse gate for the last time. The latch had been sticking in the cold for 30 years, and I had fixed it every winter, and it had stuck again every fall. And Clara had said every single year that we ought to simply replace the whole gate, and I had every single year told her I could fix it, which was true, and which had always seemed more important than simply replacing the thing. I fixed the latch that morning with the same tools I'd been using for 30 years, and then I stood at the gate and looked at the schoolhouse with its smoke rising from the chimney and the yard empty, school in session. And I thought about the morning I'd ridden into Caldwell Flats and looked for this building before I looked for anything else, and I still could not tell you exactly why that was, what some part of me knew that the rest of me was too proud to admit. I know now what it was. It was that some things do not move. Some things stay where you left them, and if you're lucky and you finally find the courage to ride back and ask the plain question instead of making a story and living in it, they'll still be there, and the gate will still stick, and the coffee will be on. I closed the latch behind me and walked up the path to bring Clara her lunch, the same as I had every Tuesday for 31 years. And the smoke from her chimney rose into the gray November sky, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.